Over a year ago, I made a video on the channel titled Hollow Knight vs Ori and the Will of the Wisps Battle of the Metroidvanias, and it became one of my most popular long-form videos on the channel. It was a very fun video to make because I had the opportunity to talk about two games that I recently played through and really enjoyed. It was some of the most fun I've ever had making a video for this channel. However, despite the video being received really well, there were still quite a bit of people that did not understand the way I determined the rankings in that video, and that's entirely my fault for being unclear, so why not make it again? Now, it's been a while since I've played through these games, but I do still love them and I'm willing to talk about them again. In my completely biased opinion, my first video on the topic is still pretty good if you want a rundown on what I thought about the games over a year ago, but this video can still be enjoyed completely independent from my original one. Some of my opinions have changed and some of them have stayed the same, so let's go ahead and begin. Actually, one more thing. Today is actually my birthday. I'm 18 this year. All I ask from you is to leave a like if you enjoyed. As long as you guys keep enjoying the content, I'll keep enjoying making videos. That being said, let's begin. We'll start the video off by discussing platforming. If you didn't know already, Metroidvania games are most known for combining both combat and platforming, but games like Hollow Knight focus more so on combat, whereas Ori and the Will of the Wisps focuses more on platforming. So I think you know where this is going. There are two areas in Hollow Knight that have phenomenal platforming: White Palace and Path of Pain, which is an extension of White Palace. These areas are generally speaking pretty amazing, although they can be made much easier by using the Hive Blood charm to regenerate health automatically. So once again, these areas are great and all, but as for the rest of the game, it does have some good platforming moments, but it's definitely not as consistently solid as it is in Ori and the Will of the Wisps, the game with the best platforming out of any Metroidvania I've played so far. While there isn't any areas of this game that are as difficult as the Path of Pain, the levels have consistently interesting and fun platforming challenges for you to enjoy. One of the reasons it's so good in this game is because each level utilizes a brand new ability. For example, one level focuses on the dash ability, while another level focuses on the grapple ability. This concept, while not being mind-blowing or anything, makes this game possibly the least repetitive Metroidvania ever made. So I have to give this one to Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Next, let's talk about combat. Naturally, since the Will of the Wisps is better at platforming, Hollow Knight is better at combat. The Will of the Wisps features a huge weapon wheel with 12 abilities. A few of these are just platforming abilities, but 8 out of 12 can be used as offensive weapons. The problem is some weapons are not very good compared to others, making the Will of the Wisps combat very unbalanced in comparison. It's still fun, but not nearly as solid as Hollow Knight. It's also annoying you can only assign 3 weapons at a time. I completely understand why it was difficult to avoid this if you're using a controller for the game, but why can't I assign more than 3 on keyboard and mouse? Anyway, just a nitpick, but it is annoying having to pause during a boss fight. As for Hollow Knight, this game has 2 general choices when it comes to combat: the melee weapon known as the nail, and the ranged/magic weapons that use energy known as soul to operate. These weapons each have their own use in combat, whether you need to smash into an enemy from above or crush them from below, and you never have to pause the game to use them either. You can also get nail upgrades that allow you to charge your melee weapon, and even though it's not always useful, it's a decent addition that can come in handy for a couple boss fights. When it comes to combat, Hollow Knight just has a more balanced moveset, and generally speaking, better hitboxes and more control of your character. There is one boss in Hollow Knight that has a pretty bad hitbox. I'm sure everyone knows what boss I'm talking about. Both games also have a feature where you can select different ability upgrades or additional effects. They're called charms in Hollow Knight and shards in the Will of the Wisps. Both games have the same issue when it comes to these abilities, and that's how unbalanced they tend to be. Some of these abilities are ridiculously good and some are awful. This is really the only part of Hollow Knight's combat that isn't perfect in my opinion. But yeah, I feel like this is one of the more easy decisions of the video, and I don't think that many people will disagree, but who knows, if you've played both games and prefer the combat in the Will of the Wisps, let me know. Next, we have art style. Listen, these games both look amazing in their own ways. Both games have a hand-drawn art style, at least as far as I know. Hollow Knight's is more simple but also imaginative, while the Will of the Wisps is more complicated and uses beautiful nature and excellent lighting. I think Hollow Knight's is more unique while the Will of the Wisps is more beautiful. I think at the end of the day, whichever art style you prefer is entirely personal preference, and I would make an objective argument for one being better than the other, but I really don't have one. They're both great. If we were talking about the first Ori game, game, Ori and the Blind Forest, which released in 2015, I think this game's art style is a bit blurry and messy. It's not bad, but it's way better in the second game. But yeah, I think Hollow Knight and Ori and the Will of the Wisps have equally fantastic graphical styles. And in terms of my opinion, I also like them both equally. I know we didn't talk about this for as long as the first two comparisons, but let's give both games a point and go ahead and move on. Next on the list, we have bosses. Spoiler alert, I will be naming a few bosses in this segment, so if you're looking to go into these games blind, you may want to skip this one. So let's go ahead and take a look at the boss lineup, shall we? Yeah, the Will of the Wisp stands absolutely no chance in terms of bosses. But to be fair, that's only because Hollow Knight has one of the best boss lineups of all time. The Will of the Wisp still has decent bosses even if it doesn't have very many. Howl is an okay starter boss, I guess. Horn Beetle is a really great second boss. Qualak is kinda annoying but still really good. Mora the Spider is my favorite boss in the game. Willowstone is underwhelming, but it's kinda just a lead up to the final boss. The final boss being Shriek, and she's arguably the best one, which is how it should be. Decent boss lineup for a 10 to 15 hour game, no doubt. But can it compete with Hollow Knight's? Zero chance. Listen, not every boss in Hollow Knight is good. There are a handful of underwhelming boss fights, but there's still 46 of them. And that's not even mentioning how many amazing bosses this game has. Broken Vessel, Dung Defender, Grey Prince Zoe, Mantis Lords, the Hollow Knight, Nightmare King Grimm, the Radiance, Sisters of Battle. No other Metroidvania can compete, and I think we should all be able to agree. So that puts the scoreboard at 3-2 in favor of Hollow Knight. Next, we have story. Which game has the better story? It's more complicated than it sounds because both games do storytelling in a completely different way. The Will of the Wisps is a traditional video game story that's incredibly emotional. Meanwhile, Hollow Knight is a game that's more so focused on lore rather than traditional storytelling. Hollow Knight's backstory is deeper, while the Will of the Wisps has a much more gripping emotional narrative. I think I'll give this one to the Will of the Wisps because it is the only video game that has ever made me cry. Sure, you could say the story is corny and unoriginal, but I have my own issues with the way Hollow Knight does it. I personally would have never even understood Hollow Knight's story if not for Mossbag's video on it. I just wasn't invested in the narrative during the game. I loved the game because the gameplay is amazing. The lore is just a bonus to me. But the Will of the Wisps, it meant something to me when I was experiencing it. There's moments in that game that you will genuinely care about. Hollow Knight's story is not bad at all and it's entertaining to think about, but I just think the Will of the Wisps is better at making you care during the moment. So once again, it's all tied up. Next, we're going to talk about the music. Which game has a better soundtrack? Now, obviously, music is generally subjective, so I'm fully open to opinions being shared in the comments. After thinking about this comparison for a while, I do truly think the Will of the Wisps has a slightly better soundtrack, and this is why. I think the Will of the Wisps music is much more emotional for several reasons. First of all is its heavy reliance on leitmotifs in its compositions. If you don't know what a leitmotif is, I'll pull up a quick Google definition. A recurrent theme throughout a musical or literary composition associated with a particular person, idea, or situation. Basically what this means is that the music in this game features reoccurring melodies and chord progressions that signify a connection or represent something even deeper. For example, another game that relies heavily on motifs is Undertale, and they sound amazing in that game as well. Now I know what you're saying, Hollow Knight has leitmotifs in its music too, and you're correct. Hollow Knight's motifs are very well done as well, and Christopher Larkin is an amazing composer. But this game does not rely on them as much as the Will of the Wisps does, and I think that's one reason why it's not as emotional. Now look, I totally get that this can also be used as an argument against the Will of the Wisps, because you might be saying that having too many motifs makes the music repetitive. But when it comes to the Will of the Wisps, I would have to disagree. I think they're done perfectly in this game. Gareth Coker is one of the best video game composers of all time when it comes to creating emotion, but that's just reason one for why I think the Will of the Wisps music is better. Reason number two is a bit more complicated, but it has to do with the narrative of these games. We already talked about the differences when it comes to storytelling in these games. The Will of the Wisps is more stereotypical and emotional. Meanwhile, Hollow Knight is much more vague and also much more unique. I personally think that it's easier for video game music to create emotion when the narrative is more designed for it. Because of this, I believe the narrative of the Will of the Wisps makes the music even better, while some of the music in Hollow Knight doesn't have as much emotional impact. Something you gotta understand about music music from movies and video games is that in order to reach their full potential, they need to work together with the narrative in order to give you a complete picture. With a game like Hollow Knight, the story is so cryptic that the music doesn't always have a chance at complementing it. I still think there's a lot of tracks in this game with great emotion. For example, City of Tears theme, Broken Vessel theme, the Hollow Knight theme, but overall, it's just not as consistently solid as the Will of the Wisps. Even the atmospheric tracks in this game have incredible emotion, but in Hollow Knight, the atmospheric tracks are still good, but don't have any emotion attached to them. Anyway, I could talk about this forever since music is my favorite thing about video games, so we can continue to discuss it more in the comments. I'm giving this comparison to Ori and the Will of the Wisps, which means it's currently in the lead. I'm sure I'll get a bunch of comments saying I'm just a hater, and that I'm actually completely wrong about Hollow Knight's soundtrack, which in reality, I'm not saying it's bad at all. It's just the other game has way better emotional impact. And by the way, I do still like a lot of the music in this game. But yeah, like I said, we can continue to discuss this in the comments. Now that we've covered the main topics, we're now going to cover the more niche comparisons. Each of these will count as half a point since they're not as significant as the previous topics. Let's begin with content. Which game has more meaningful content? The answer is Hollow Knight. I think 99% of the content in this game is worth doing. I don't think Pantheon 5 is worth doing, unless you're already really good at the game like I was after my playthrough. Otherwise, it will just be a frustrating experience for you. But yeah, other than that, this game has way more content than the Will of the Wisps, and I'm not saying that's inherently a good thing, but in this case it is a good thing because the content is mostly all fantastic. Moving on to price point, which game is less expensive? Both games are actually very respectable prices. On digital storefronts, Hollow Knight retails for $14.99 and the Will of the Wisps retails for $29.99. It's also worth mentioning both games regularly go on sale for under $10, but by technicality, Hollow Knight wins this comparison. Moving on to memorability, I understand this one is subjective because there's memorable moments from both of these games, but like I mentioned earlier, Ori and the Will of the Wisps is the only game that has ever made me shed tears, so sure, let's give this one to that game. Which game is more difficult? While the Will of the Wisps does feature a hard difficulty, it still ends up being less difficult than the base game of Hollow Knight. I don't think Hollow Knight is as difficult as people think, but there's definitely some insanely challenging things in this game, so this one goes to Hollow Knight. Moving on to accessibility, the Will of the Wisps is way more accessible of a game because it has 3 different difficulty options, which I think is a very good thing. I fully understand why Hollow Knight doesn't have an easy mode, but still, this one goes to the Will of the Wisps. Moving on to mods. Which game has the best mods? I'm not sure how many mods there are for the Will of the Wisps, but one thing's for sure, the mod scene is definitely not as big as Hollow Knight's is. There's a lot of great mods for Hollow Knight, and even though I personally don't use mods most of the time, it's still something a ton of people do enjoy. And finally, the final niche comparison, performance. Which game has the best consistent FPS? I'm pretty sure the Will of the Wisps can technically reach higher FPS numbers on the PC version. However, when it comes to the Switch version, it's a bit rough around the edges. It's still a playable game on Nintendo Switch, but it just doesn't perform nearly as well. Meanwhile, Hollow Knight performs as well as you'd ever need it to no matter what device you're using, and that's why I think it deserves this one. So the final score of this video is 5.5 to 5 in favor of Hollow Knight. I promise I didn't intentionally make the score this close just to make it more interesting. These are truly my opinions at the moment. Of course, I could always change my opinion after this video is a few months old, but as of right now, this is genuine. So the final results of this video were actually a bit different than my original video on the topic, but one thing stayed the same, and that's Hollow Knight being on top. I do believe Hollow Knight is the best Metroidvania of all time. However, it's actually not my personal favorite. My personal favorite Metroidvania is Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Listen, there is a difference between the best game and my favorite game. If I say a game is my favorite, that doesn't mean I think it's the best game. I think I didn't explain this distinction in the original video, which is why some people were confused on what my true opinions are. I believe that video games are a mix between subjective and objective. I believe Hollow Knight is a better overall game, but on a personal level, I actually do prefer the Will of the Wisps, as it's extremely relatable to me. At the end of the day, both games are worth giving a shot. Most people who enjoyed one of the games will enjoy the other one as well, so I hope this video encourages you to check them out. And that's it for today. Thanks to everybody who wished me a happy birthday, and I hope to talk to you again soon.